WisconsinEye is at the Eau Claire Public Library. We're interviewing candidates in the special election in Senate District 10. Brian Corriea is the Libertarian candidate. He's from Wilson. The general election is January 16th. Brian, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you.
Is this your first run for public office?
It is.
Okay, then a short version of your bio and why you're running.
Well, I graduated from high school in Mondovi, Wisconsin, and I'm a 9-year Navy veteran. I've done a lot of traveling, and I've been involved in politics from the outside for quite some time, and I really believe that it's time for a third voice. There's a lot of divisiveness in politics right now, and as a Libertarian candidate, I hope to be able to bridge some divides and bring good ideas back to the forefront. What's
wrong with the two traditional parties, the R's and the D's, Brian?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there's more than two voices in our country. There's more than two voices in our state. There are people who find themselves siding with both Republicans and Democrats depending on the issue. As a Libertarian, I look at myself as a fiscal conservative, but I also view myself as a social liberal. And when you look at the polling, 60% of Americans kind of fall into that category. They want government to be more responsible, but they also want government to stay out of our personal lives. So the Libertarian voice represents that position.
Is there any one issue on the state or national stage that really made you decide to run this cycle?
Nothing in particular on this cycle. I think there's some serious issues facing Wisconsin that Libertarians, the Libertarian view can certainly help with. We have serious issues with a drug epidemic in Wisconsin. We have funding issues. I think a lot of people have passionate feelings about the Foxconn deal. So all of those things, I think the Libertarian voice is unique in addressing those things, and I just want to represent the people of my district.
All of which I want to get to. So let's start with Foxconn. Had you been in the state Senate, that $3 billion package worth of incentives, how would you have voted?
I would have voted no on Foxconn.
Why?
A couple of different reasons. First and foremost, I don't believe that that's the proper role for government. Government isn't supposed to take taxpayer money and choose winners and losers with it. They're not supposed to hand out special favors to big business. That's not what the role of government is. If we're going to take $3 billion in tax incentives, why are we not reducing the tax burden on Wisconsin businesses that have a history of hiring Wisconsin citizens, that have a history of following our environmental rules, which Foxconn obviously got some waivers for. So I just don't think from that perspective it's the right role of government. More importantly, I don't think it's a good deal. We're looking at a 20 to 25-year return on investment with Foxconn. Well, there's not a business out there that's going to invest that kind of money, such a substantial investment, and not look for a return for 20 to 25 years. Are we really going to believe that an assembly plant putting together LCD screens is not going to be automated in 10 years? I mean, I know that there's some ties to employment in regards to the tax incentives that they're going to get, but if you read the press clippings on Foxconn, they're very aggressive about automating their plants throughout Asia. I find it very hard to believe that we're not going to see the same thing happen here in Wisconsin down the road. And so I just don't think it's a very good deal long-term for the Wisconsin taxpayer.
If Foxconn is not the way to grow Wisconsin's economy in terms of jobs, what are some other ways to grow it, sir?
Well, like I said, we gave Foxconn $3 billion in tax incentives. We're at the bottom third in terms of tax climate. We're overtaxed. Our businesses are paying too much taxes here. And so if we're really going to be competitive, if we really want to transform our economy in the future, then we need to reduce that tax burden on businesses. We need to create a permanent environment across the state that encourages business to invest here, not one-off sweetheart deals to other industry.
So would you cut the personal income tax or the corporate tax or both?
Both.
Both.
Well, I'm a Libertarian, so if it were up to me, we wouldn't have a corporate tax or a personal income tax. There are better ways to get things done than forced taxation. So there are states out there that don't have a personal income tax. There are states out there that are looking at eliminating the property tax. You want to talk about a friendly environment, that's where it'd be. I know that we can't wave a wand and make those things go away, but we have to start working towards that direction in total tax reduction.
Well, if we cut if we do away with the corporate, as you'd like to do, and cut the personal income, how do we pay for K-12 schools and the UW system and our prisons then?
It's a great question. And it's always a concern when Libertarians talk about tax cuts. How are we going to continue to provide the services that I believe government does play a major role in providing? It's very important that we start allowing private industry to rise up and compete with government. I think that, well, I know that if we allow private industry to compete with government, that eventually they're going to surpass government's ability to provide these services. We have a $700 million overrun on our transportation bill, or in our transportation spending. That's unacceptable. We spend more per capita to educate our kids than any other country in the world, and our results aren't where they need to be. So it's not necessarily about money and how much we can spend on these programs. It's about making sure that they're run efficiently. And I think the private industry does just a much better job of delivering goods and services to people than government does. I mean, look at it like this: where do you get better service? Do you get better service from the private sector, or do you get better service from the government? Are you happier when you leave Target or the DMV? So that's kind of how I view things. I know that we can start moving in that direction.
The DMV is, of course, is part of the Department of Transportation, which gets us to the issue of how do you pay for the highways of the future and the maintenance projects of the future, which delayed the state budget by a couple months.
Correct. Well, with roads, it's not a popular issue to talk about tolling, to talk about user fees, and things of that nature. But when we look at paying for the roads, right now we have cost overruns, massive cost overruns in our highway spending bill. Okay, and the reason for that is because we don't have a good bidding process. What we're saying is we're going to go out and we're essentially going to award this contract to the lowest possible bidder. Right? That's how government buys things. The problem is that encourages a dishonest approach to bidding. That's how we end up with these cost overruns. Now, I have a very dear friend of mine who's a general contractor, and he's not the guy who's remodeling your bathroom. He's overseeing multi-million-dollar large-scale projects. In the private sector, when a contractor gets hired to do this kind of work, it's expected that they come in on budget and on time. We aren't able to hold contractors, the companies that we're hiring to actually build these roads, to the same standard because we're asking them to bid in a dishonest manner. So we really need to do a better job auditing these bids when they come in so we can avoid these overruns on the front end, and that's going to allow us to properly prioritize the money that we're spending on our roads.
Do you see any need to raise either the gas tax, the license plate renewal fee, or to begin tolling on our major highways, sir?
I wouldn't support any of those things immediately. I think the first step into getting this under control is we have to start looking at projects and prioritizing. We can't just say we need to do all these things and we're going to spend all this money and demand that the taxpayer keep stepping forward and keep reaching into his pocket to pay for poor management by government. Okay, so we have to start looking at prioritizing projects. We're going to have to put some things on hold, and we're going to have to say this is more important than that is, and so we're going to work on this first. And for projects that haven't been begun, projects that we're looking at in the future that are part of this budget, we have to say, okay, let's take a second look at this bidding process and make sure that we're getting realistic figures on how we can move forward on these projects.
In your opening statement, you mentioned the opioid and heroin epidemic. What are the next steps? I mean, Wisconsin has passed a series of laws, but we still have a major epidemic. Methamphetamine is a big problem in this area. What are the next steps to try to get a handle on that, to lower the incident rates?
The first thing we have to do is make sure that we're spending our money intelligently. We have limited resources across the board. So are we spending our money in intelligent ways? We have to look at what our goal is when it comes to law enforcement. Is our goal to punish drug users, or is our goal to prevent people from using in the first place? Is our goal to imprison people, or is our goal to rehabilitate people? We have to start looking at, when you look at over 30,000 nonviolent offenders, or 30 some odd % of prisoners in the Wisconsin prison system are nonviolent offenders. Mm-hmm. It costs us $33,000 a year per prisoner to keep them in jail. That's a conservative estimate of $200 million a year to keep nonviolent offenders in prison. So that's part one. We have to start looking at, are we putting these people in a position to have success and re-enter society and become contributing members again? The second thing is the nation is moving towards decriminalization of marijuana, and I think Wisconsin needs to get on board with that. We need to take our law enforcement dollars and our law enforcement resources, and we need to direct them to the more serious issue of methamphetamine and opioid usage. And so by decriminalizing and turning that into a revenue stream instead of a burden on our law enforcement, I think that's a positive step in the right direction.
Healthcare. Medicaid is a major expenditure of state government. What are your thoughts on healthcare as a Libertarian candidate?
Well, healthcare is another perfect example of how we took something that was working well in the free market and destroyed it. Their mandates nothing drives up cost like mandates. Okay, when we say if you're a health insurance provider in the state of Wisconsin, you have to provide this, you have to provide that, you have to provide this. All these things need to be covered. And so we drive up health insurance costs. Okay, as you drive up health insurance costs, you create greater need. It's a cycle that we're stuck in now. The cost keeps getting higher, which creates more government need, which means we're going to subsidize more, which drives up costs even further. So the first thing we need to do in Wisconsin is with the rollback of the Affordable Care Act and the elimination of the mandates, Wisconsin needs to take advantage of that and start creating a truly free market for health care. We need to eliminate mandates. We need to allow people to go out and buy the health insurance that they feel they need for themselves and their families without tacking on a bunch of things. I think the best way to explain it would be this. What would happen if the Wisconsin state government said, if you're going to sell a car in the state of Wisconsin, it has to have heated leather seats, and it has to have a sunroof, and it has to have a backup camera, and it has to have all these options. Well, a lot less people would be able to afford cars at that point. So what would happen? The government would come in and subsidize those cars. They'd start buying more, which would push the cost up further. That's what we're doing with health care. I should be able to go out as a healthy individual and say, I just want to buy a plan that's going to cover me in the event of something catastrophic, and I don't want anything else. I should be allowed to make that decision for myself. More freedom of choice will create more competition and lower costs.
1 in 5 Wisconsin residents get all or part of their health care through Medicaid. Is our Medicaid program too generous? Following up on the health care issue?
I don't know that I wouldn't say that the Medicaid plan is too generous. What I would say is that Medicaid needs to compete with private insurance on an even playing field. Medicaid comes in and tells providers that there's essentially 3 pricing models for healthcare providers. Okay, there's what they charge a person with no insurance, then there's what they charge a person with private insurance, and then there's what they charge a person with government insurance. So government insurance doesn't compete on a level playing field with private insurance. And so as a result, you're getting price distortions in the market. So they're billing private insurance at higher rates to cover what they are charging, what Medicare and Medicaid are forcing them to take. And that creates a price distortion. And so I would like to see healthcare in the private healthcare be cheaper, again, by creating freedom of choice in terms of how you shop for health insurance. And I think that freedom would make private health insurance very competitive with Medicaid. More providers accept private insurance and Medicaid. You have to search for the Medicaid provider, who takes it, who doesn't. So I think we can provide better health insurance benefits for Wisconsin residents through more freedom of choice.
There's a fight in the Capitol over what's called the dark store issue, and this is how should a major retail store that's closed, not open, be assessed? And judges have held that the assessed values of open stores should be lowered because of the dark store. There's bills pending. Have you studied the issue? Do you have a position?
Yeah. Again, we're looking at a revenue issue at the municipal level, right? We're looking at dark stores. We're losing tax base because, this store is paying taxes based on what that vacant building is worth as opposed to what that actual business is worth. And so really what we're looking at is we're trying to figure out a way to increase revenue. That's what the municipalities are talking about. Again, we're attacking a symptom of the disease. The disease right now is overspending. Okay, one of the largest expenses for municipalities, one of the largest spending increases for municipalities is debt service. Okay, we've overspent and now we're servicing this debt from the past. So we can look at different ways to raise taxes or to try and protect our tax base, but unless we get spending under control at the municipal level, it's not going to make any difference. So no, I wouldn't support being able to tax business at a higher level. I think in the long run, that makes us less competitive. And I think more importantly, we have to understand that businesses don't pay taxes, just like they don't pay salaries or pay their electric bill. Everything that a business pays for is paid for by the consumer. So if we're talking about shifting costs, we can tax the business at a higher level, but all you're going to do is drive up prices and stagnate wages. That's the reality of the situation.
A bill that could come up for vote in the Capitol next year would prohibit research on fetal tissue from elective abortions. Your position on that?
I'm very uncomfortable with it. This is not an easy question to answer. So from a scientific perspective and trying to set our own moral and ethical dilemmas with it aside, I look at it as abortion right now is the law of the land. And I can't look somebody in the face who's suffering from Parkinson's, who's suffering from any disease that can potentially be cured, and say, because of my discomfort with this, we're going to potentially bypass finding a cure. We use human cadavers for medical research. This is not a new thing. This has been around for a long time. There are breakthroughs that are that I think we're waiting to come out of this. Like I said, it's an uncomfortable issue, but I wouldn't support banning that research. I would support continuing that research.
Senate District 10 is unique because it has two four-year universities, and that's River Falls and Stout. If you think we have a state government overspending problem, what's state government's obligation to the two four-year universities in Senate District 10?
Well, I mean, the reality is when you look at the universities are actually very well funded. I don't know that they don't necessarily need a great deal of taxpayer assistance to continue to offer the services that they do. The universities are very well endowed. They have their own fundraising efforts. We all know what tuition looks like. So I think that the universities are, I don't know that the taxpayers have a huge obligation to the university.
The governor and lawmakers say we have frozen tuition for 6 years. Maybe that should continue. Do you think it should, the freeze on resident undergrad tuition?
No. It's up to the universities to decide. They're independent institutions. They're not for profit, but they're independent institutions. It's up to them to decide and to let the market decide what's fair for tuition. What I would say is that when we're looking at massive increases in the cost of tuition, we're looking at massive government and federal subsidy. If you trace back the increase in both health care costs and tuition costs, you can trace those right back to when the federal government really started subsidizing these things. And again, it creates a creates a price distortion in the market that's pushing that cost up. So no, the university should be allowed to set their own tuition rates, but we have to look at why those rates are climbing so high and more on a national level than a state level, unfortunately.
There's a bill in the Assembly that would lower the drinking age to 19 if we aren't penalized by the federal government and lose $53 million a year. Your position?
The drinking age should be lowered to 19. It should be lowered to 19 whether we lose that money or not. Sometimes doing the right thing costs a little bit of money. And look, if the federal government, the hypocrisy of the federal government on this particular issue kind of makes me angry. As I mentioned earlier, I served in the Navy for 9 years. I signed my enlistment papers when I was 17 years old. If the federal government thinks that you have to be 21 years old to have a beer, then they shouldn't be sending recruiters into high schools to try and talk kids into joining the military. If the federal government thinks that you need to be 21 years old to drink a beer, they shouldn't be subsidizing massive loans to college students who really probably don't understand the long-term implications of taking on that kind of debt. So I think there's some hypocrisy on the federal level there. I think the states, not just Wisconsin, but the states at large need to push back against that. It seems like an unimportant issue, but that level of hypocrisy from the federal government really upsets me.
Do you want to highlight differences between you and the Republican and Democratic candidates? Or I guess another way to ask the question is, why should Senate District 10 elect a Libertarian?
Well, I think that this is an exciting time. This is a special election, right? So this is a free pass for voters. I think people in their heart of hearts have wanted to see a third-party candidate. They want to hear a difference of opinion. They want somebody who isn't locked into a particular ideology. So guess what? If I win this election, it's not going to change the balance of power in the Senate. It's not going to threaten a legislative agenda. But this is a great opportunity for voters to say, you know what? I'm going to support a third-party candidate. And we're going to put somebody in there who's going to sound different. He's going to say things that are a little bit different than what we've been hearing over the last several decades. So I'm very excited about the opportunity.
Thank you. Brian Corriea of Wilson is a Libertarian candidate in the special election in Senate District 10. The general election in Senate District 10 is January 16th. Mr. Corriea, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.